like 22? I've been thinking I've been thinking a lot about it. I suppose all of you have, right, to come back after 50 years. Isn't that extraordinary? 50 years. And we came to Chapel Hill at a time, well, what I remember was beginning as freshmen, dressing up for football games. Women had hours that they had to be in at the end. And I know we're going to introduce Ken Weiss in a minute, the music, right? So especially for those of you that are North Carolinians, the TAMs were the big deal. By the time we left, it was Jefferson Airplane and the Grateful Dead. An extraordinary time to grow up. And I taught here for many years, and I will say that generations of students were jealous of us for this particular set of years that we came here. Just an extraordinary time. The war and war protests, psychedelia, and mostly all the rules that our parents and society laid out for us came into question. It was an amazing, amazing time to grow up. All right, I'm going to introduce the panelists in just a second, but I want to take just a brief moment of personal privilege to talk about three of our classmates that are no longer with us, people who really had an impact. Tom Bello left us about 6 or 7 years ago. And Tommy, it's an extraordinary life. Rhodes Scholar, went to Yale Law School, but didn't finish because he wanted to make a difference in the world and became a Catholic lay leader and beloved for the work that he did helping those who struggled with life. A year above us, ahead of us, was a fellow named Nelson Drew. I don't know if any of you knew Nelson, but he was married to one of our classmates, Sandy Snyder. And Nelson was in Air Force ROTC, became an Air Force officer, Air Force intelligence, ended up getting a doctorate, teaching at the Air Force Academy. And he became America's greatest expert on Bosnia and the former Yugoslavia. And during the war there, Nelson, very sadly, was killed, along with two other American leaders, in an automobile accident. His armored vehicle went off a cliff. He was 47. Extraordinary impact. Probably more responsible than anybody else for ending the war in Bosnia. And then Charlie Dean, a year behind us. Charlie was Howard Dean's brother. Howard Dean, who was the former governor of Vermont and head of the Democratic National Committee. He was a kid, I think maybe 24 or 25, when he did as many of our generation did, set off on a worldwide expedition. And somehow he got into Southeast Asia, was captured in Laos with another young man, and essentially disappeared. It was many years later that we learned that he was executed after a couple of years. Now, obviously, Charlie is just one of us, was not looking to do anything untoward, but wrong place at the wrong time, and the excitement of youth. So I just want to take a second to honor those three folks, all of whom extraordinary people. Okay, with that, sorry. If any of you guys know these folks? Yeah, it's, what a time. What a time.
Tommy Bell, president of student body.
That's right. That's right.
Son of Bluebell.
Son of Bluebell, that's right. And Doug, I know, I see you in the back there. You were close to Tommy, weren't you?
Judy was his classmate.
Yeah, his wife Judy was also our classmate. Okay, with that in mind, cultural change. With thanks to Margaret, where are you, Margaret? Whose idea this was. I'm just going to briefly introduce the three panelists. Catherine Turk cannot be here today. She was ill, so. And forgive my mask, by the way. I'm immunocompromised, so I'm being as careful as I can these days. I'm fine, by the way, but you got to do what you got to do. Ken Weiss, entrepreneur in residence in music. I'm meeting everybody except Jim today for the first time, but looking at their bios is pretty damn impressive, especially for our generation. Development of a music publishing company, which recorded Crosby, Stills and Nash, Fleetwood Mac, Aretha Franklin, Bob Seger, Joe Cocker. All those names are familiar to folks our age. Our age. Can you imagine we would have thought 50 years, it would be 50 years? Nah, can't even think about it. Remember, that was never trust anybody over 30. Molly Worthen, who's Department of Religion, whose work focuses on North American religious and intellectual history. And then Jim Johnson, William Kenan Distinguished Professor of Strategy and Entrepreneurship for the Urban Investment Strategy Center. Jim, for those of you who don't know, is an icon here at UNC. He's one of those handful of names that everybody knows. I know he's embarrassed to say that. Sorry, Jim. Fabulous person. So with that in mind, our plan is just to let each speaker speak for a short time and then spend most of our time on questions. So anybody want to volunteer to start?
Well, thank you, Alan. That is moving. I've been teaching here in the entrepreneurship minor for 13 years now, and it's rare that I'm among peers as I am today, so I'm feeling quite comfortable. Thank you all for being here. I was thinking about this session the other day and writing things out and taking some notes because I'm likely to forget some. I'm sure that some of us can relate. And then I sort of reviewed them over and over again, and I was getting bored. And if I could bore myself, trust me, you guys would be ahead of that. So I started thinking more about the influences that the entire period had in my life, and recognizing the social and cultural changes that were taking place. And try to resist the temptation of thinking that these sort of titanic changes that have occurred over the last 50, 60 years were unique. In the way that the phrase culture wars is common, as if it's a new thing, when in actual fact it's been going on for more years than I can think. But at the same time, the ones that we all lived through are the ones that are most profound for us. Excuse me. And my first recollection of that sort of spirit was, there was a movie called Blackboard Jungle in the early 1950s. And not only was I too young I barely remember it, but I do remember there was this sort of nervous energy around it. And the grown-ups in our lives then were going to make sure that we don't get to see that movie. And of course, obviously, all we wanted was to somehow see this movie. And I think I finally did see it at some point, and it meant nothing to me except the music period. There was Bill Haley and the Comets. And for those of you that remember who that was a rock and roll experience in the early 1950s that treaded that line between some kind of brand new musical experience, but they couched it in this sort of formal kind of way. They all wore suits and ties while they played their instruments, and they were physically moving around quite a bit. And one of my rock and roll colleagues growing up said to me that he also saw Bill Haley in the Comets Live, and he said it reminded him of his friend's fathers putting a band together in the garage. And it's true, that's how they looked. And, but it was still this sort of music, this spirit that was driving it. And whatever happened in the rest of the movie, I honestly don't recall, except for some high school kids saying almost dirty words and stuff like that. But the backdrop of all of that in the 1950s, without getting deep into the historical context, was, you know, we had come out of a post-war environment. It was an economic boom throughout the country at that time. But at the same time, we were nervous about, well, the Korean War had just taken place. There was a lot of talk about nuclear war, Sputnik, McCarthy hearings. Hardly, I think David Halberstam wrote a book called The 50s, which is very interesting because we look at it as a sort of this sleepy period before the 1960s, and it was anything but that. But as a young child, it was just, you know, boring in general. And then one day, out of the blue, out of the sky, dropped this guy. And I watched him on TV one night, and it was Elvis. And everything changed. This wasn't a guy who wore his dad's suits. This is a guy who did exactly what he wanted to do. He did things that were unprecedented. He did it musically, he did it vocally. He played guitar in a way that was unique, to say the least. And above all, not unlike Blackboard Jungle, we didn't get to see him from the waist down. Needless to say, it's the only thing we wanted to see is what the heck he was doing down there. And that created almost a culture in and of itself. Those of us that were restricted from doing so many things up till that point were now free to watch Elvis. Elvis was now representing us, not our parents and our teachers and all the authority figures in our lives. And we took to that quite well. And for the next 4 years, we watched that change take place. We were part of that change, of course. And then, jumping a little bit ahead, I'd like to say the fix was in during that period. And 1960 came along, and instead of those, you know, graybeards like Eisenhower, Truman, John Kennedy became president. He was one of ours. We were now not just represented on the Ed Sullivan Show. We were represented throughout the whole world by this dynamic man. And during that little period, music almost took a back seat because Elvis went in the army in 1960. You know, it was like, oh, bye. And Jack Kennedy in 1960 and finally in 1963, the tragedy of the Kennedy assassination that disrupted everybody's lives, but was a cultural change that had to be, it's almost as if these profound cultural changes don't happen as gradually as it appears. Sometimes it's almost a minute-by-minute thing. The Kennedy assassination, and some of which took place on television, when Oswald was assassinated and all that sort of stuff that went on, they call it how, you know, the innocence of our time evaporated on that day. That's not an overstatement. It's not. And for the next 10 weeks, and I remember this quite clearly, the nation was in the doldrums. There was this sort of palpable depression, if you will, that was taking place. Walking around trying to figure out, how could this happen? This is beyond crazy. And of course, because it was one of our guys, we saw that as an invasion. We saw that as ripping that from our consciousness, from our representation. It was really profound. And 10 weeks later, a very similar experience happened that was similar to 1956. These 4 guys from England dropped out of the sky. They looked good. They had long hair, such as it was. They were funny. The music was exhilarating. We'd never heard anything quite like it. And almost instantly shook us out of that depression, out of those doldrums of the previous 10 weeks. And by themselves, what appeared to be a phenomenon that will come and go never left. Even today, that catalog of music has defined generation after generation, and it's still alive. But during that time, we remember the conversation was always about does art imitate culture? Does culture imitate art? How does this even work? And in actual fact, they're probably one and the same. The Beatles were doing what they were doing, and the music they were creating was defining a social experience for everybody. Every time they recorded, it was a new experience. And for me, the influence on that was enormous. Somewhere in the middle of that, I got drafted into the Army, and a 2-year experience that I had in the 1960s was an eye-opener, to say the least. And what followed after that, we became a generation of activists, something that never happened before. We were disrupting life throughout the country, cities throughout the country, in Washington, D.C., and especially on college campuses, where the largest concentration of this demographic was taking place. And all of those things were rattling the status quo. And I guess we knew it, but in actual fact, music was still the soundtrack that held us all together, that defined artistically the expression of our experience. We couldn't really define it in our own minds. We were still this larger generation, but at the same time we were, the Vice President of the United States referred to the press and the protesters in Washington as nattering nabobs of negativity or negativism. Everybody's rushing to the dictionary like, what the hell is a nabob? But that's what it was. In other words, we were treated derisively. We didn't have a case. We were just an annoyance. And that sharpened the divisions between the haves and the have-nots. I remember very well May 4th, 1970, when the government brought in the National Guard into Kent State in Ohio. And those National Guardsmen fired on a group of protesters on the Kent State campus and murdered 4 young people and wounded many others. It was a shock to the system. It had raised the ante quite high. And 2 days later, and I was among them, 250,000 young people converged on Washington, D.C. Now, keep in mind, there was no internet. Social media wasn't even a thing. How did we all know? What did that? We were responsible people. We were outraged by what took place. And en masse, 250,000 people who didn't know each other arrived in the same place. And so did a lot of music people, and so did a lot of political people, and so did a lot of senators, so did a lot of Congress people. I remember sitting in the crowds among people I only saw on TV, demanding an end to the body bags that were coming home at 200 bodies a week, year after year, an outrageous event. And music was always there to both soothe us in the times of need, which this was, and at the same time unite us together. Without the internet, without social media, that drove us. We knew, we sort of within our own little culture understood what to do. And life was never the same again. And nobody was ready for it. Campuses throughout the country were being disrupted, and administration didn't know how to deal with it. Rightfully, how could they? They'd never seen this one before. So over the years, and I, part of why I chose to, write this all out was to avoid what I'm doing now, which is to keep talking. So I don't want to do that because a lot of very interesting stuff's going to come out of the rest of my colleagues here. But I want to say that my own experience, I was lucky enough to have built a career in the arts, in music, in film, in television, in theater, and a lot of other stuff. And I recognized the role, if not the power, that the arts had to define a cultural experience. The group, I was with a group for 30 years, and we played many, many shows, and I recall standing in front of lots of people and watching them all be united as one. There was some power in that I found exhilarating and also hopeful. It was that we were not really alone. We were all together in this process. And although we might have been very idealistic, with also a powerful sense of certitude, which is appropriate for the age, but at the same time, that strength in numbers mattered. We changed presidential elections. It took a long time for that war to end, but we played our role in doing so. It wasn't going to be overnight. But the point is that the arts have always played that role. The arts are the artistic expression of our anxieties, the artistic expression of what is taking place in the world that we can now define and distill down to a 3-minute idea. Fascinated by that. I'm grateful to have been able to spend my career doing that, and now teaching at this university and watching some campus disturbances take place, thinking, I've seen this one before, and it's a fascinating thing. I would not have been born at another time than when I was, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to have lived through the turbulence of that period. There's so much more to say about this that we can go on here for the rest of the morning. I'm doing everything I can to limit the time I'm taking. So I'm gonna say this: when I teach in the entrepreneurship program, my track class is loosely referred to as arts entrepreneurship, which I always thought was redundant because there is no arts without entrepreneurship. And in fact, I might even argue the reverse is also true, but that's a completely different conversation. So I'm grateful that you're all here. I'm grateful to participate in this, and thank you, Alan, for having us. And when we do some Q&As, maybe we can sort of expand on a few things we've talked about. But I just as soon turn it over and hear what my colleagues have to say. Very learned people. You're going to get a lot out of this. So thank you so much for enduring this.
Jim told me I have to go next. So I'm so glad to be here. I'm really eager to hear your perspective on some of the trends that I'm going to comment on, partly as a historian and a journalist who's been trying to write about and make sense of the role of religion in American public life for, 15 years or something now. And then also from my perch at UNC, both as someone in the classroom, but also as the acting director of a new program we have on campus called the Program for Public Discourse, that is trying to get a bit better at both fostering in the classroom and modeling in public spaces on campus how we can have fruitful disagreements among people with different worldviews, which is something that I think as a country we're not doing very well at. I want to make 4 points. 2 are about the broader national cultural context, and 2 are more particular to the context on campus, although I don't think they're unique to UNC in general. And this is coming out of one of the questions we were given as panelists to kind of percolate on is, well, what has changed, since 1971? How are students today different or similar from then? As someone who's very interested in religion, one of the big narratives of kind of Western history that I'm very focused on is the story of secularization. what appears to many observers to be a kind of retreating authority on the part of traditional institutions of organized religion from the public square, the polls that tell us about declining rates of piety, church membership, people showing up to worship on weekends. And the polls are very interesting on this. So every year when Pew or Gallup goes out and calls people up and asks them, well, what religious labels do you attach to yourself? A growing proportion of people say none, right? They say, I'm nothing. And that, for a small number of those people, that means atheist or agnostic. But for the vast majority of that growing proportion, and it's about 30% now of Americans say none, no religious affiliation, they don't mean atheist or agnostic. They mean, I'm something, I'm spiritual but not religious, I pick and choose, I've got this kind of smorgasbord of religious ideas and traditions I've been exposed to, and I'm not sure what I make of it, but I'm still working on it. What I see among students today, especially in the South, right? I mean, 82% of our students come from the state of North Carolina by order of state statute, is that it is much harder now for a student to be what I'll call a cultural Christian, especially in a context like UNC, where they are encountering a wide range of pretty vocal, different perspectives on metaphysics. So I suspect that in the 60s and 70s, it was easier to kind of come into young adulthood having inherited a certain set of ideas, which were most likely Christian, most likely Protestant, a set of practices. Maybe you faded off going to church as often as you did when you were living under your parents' watchful eye, but you thought of yourself as generally Christian. And that identity was not necessarily closely associated with a particular political party. It could mean different things in different contexts. What I see now is that Christians, no matter what their particular variety of Christian background, have to, especially in a context like UNC, because it has become so pluralistic, they have to really think about what that means, and they have to own it. My students are taking classes in the history of religion because they are trying in a very self-conscious way to work out what they really think about the basic truth claims of their religious tradition, and also what the consequences are for their kind of public existence, what it means for their citizenship. So there's a self-consciousness that I think on the whole is a really good thing. It's a healthy thing for American Christianity generally, that it's getting harder to be sort of knee-jerk and unreflective about it. I will say that this broad story of secularization is one that does suggest that despite centuries of a quite exceptional cultural and political situation in America as compared to our peer countries in Western Europe, where organized religious practice has remained much more vital in this country than it has in Western Europe and to some extent Canada. We're seeing, on the one hand, a sort of gradual drift in our religious practices toward what we see in Western Europe. So on the one hand, you could say, okay, that must mean that Christianity in particular is kind of fading away as a cultural force. But I would add the crucial caveat that pattern of secularization is happening within the context of a worldwide religious revival, especially a revival of Christianity, and especially in the global South. And large numbers of immigrants who are coming to this country are bringing with them quite vibrant religious practices. Christian denominations in this country that are historically have been majority white. Take for example the Southern Baptist Convention are Browning. A huge proportion, something like 2/3 of new Southern Baptist churches opening their doors every year are pastored by ministers of color, not white guys. So the face of Christianity is changing. Christianity is not dying. Our students are wrestling with that. Second point about context is polarization. And as Ken said, there's our iteration of the culture wars and the kind of sorting that's happened in which people have an almost religious commitment to their partisan affiliation that has in some ways replaced how zealous people felt about religion 50 years ago. So 50 years ago, you look at the poll data, when social scientists would call up American households and say, how would you feel if your daughter wanted to marry a Catholic, or your daughter wanted to marry, a Jewish guy, if you're a Protestant? And large numbers of Americans would respond with horror at the idea of their kid marrying outside their religious tradition. Now, pollsters ask that same question: how would you feel, you registered Democrat, if your son married a Republican girl? And that question evokes that kind of outrage. So there is this, our tribal instincts, and humans are tribal and we are religious. We will find an idol to worship. If you take away our church, our temple, we will find something else to worship. That impulse is being funneled into partisan affiliation. So our students are navigating that. But as much as there are features of their situation that are different from what it was like when y'all were on campus, they themselves see some echoes. So I was struck a few years ago when one of our student activist groups found a text produced by the Black student movement in 1968 and read it verbatim. I think they did this in the pit. This was a public event. So the students themselves saw the echoes. And in many ways, you go back, and as a historian, I spend time reading newspapers from the 60s and 70s about campus activism. And in so many ways, the scripts are the same. The dividing lines are the same. The generational tensions are very similar. But there are key differences, of course, in context. So 2 quick points about the context on campus that our students are navigating that were not in place when you were here. The first, and this is obvious, is this intense culture of performance and surveillance that comes with the omnipresence of social media. And what we've seen when we survey our students, and some of my colleagues have done this, asking our students on campus, how free do you feel to express your views in class? Are you worried that your professors are going to punish you if you express a view that is ideologically different from theirs? Are you worried about your peers? What we see is really strikingly high levels of self-censorship in class from our students, and that lines up with the national data. So there are national polls that confirm the same thing is happening on other campuses. They are, to some extent, concerned about their professors punishing them. And this is something we see more among conservative students than liberals and moderates, although liberals and moderates express this concern also. But far more, well, not far more, but significantly more than worrying about their professor, their kind of liberal, former hippie professor punishing them for dissenting in some way, they are worried about their peers. They're worried about their peers shaming them, posting something on social media, and I think at the same time they're realizing that they're figuring out who they are as individuals in a way that is public and permanent because it lives on the internet in a way that was not true certainly when I was an undergraduate. And so this is the last point. This is a point about authenticity. I think our students have been saturated in a culture, and I think this is true whether they come from conservative homes or more progressive homes or somewhere in the murky middle. They've been saturated in an American culture that says, be yourself. You're on campus to express and figure out this sort of authentic core of you that has always been there, that is just waiting to come out. And the role of university is to just provide an environment in which that little flower can flourish. And our admissions process kind of coaches them along in this in a very sort of pinched way, in which we'll figure out which identity category you already, as an 18-year-old, fit into, in which you can sort of market yourself to the admissions officers. And then once you get here, your job is to be an authentic version of whatever that box is that you ticked. My own view is that that's bananas. That's not what university is for now. That's not what it was ever for, right? It's for taking this sort of unformed welter of questions and intuitions and earnest thoughts about the world that the average 18-year-old has, and then encountering a range of worldviews and ancient texts and modern texts and classmates who are like you and classmates who are very different. And having a newly sort of open attitude toward what is possible for your existence as an adult and all the ways in which you can be useful as a citizen, not to sort of cling all the more tightly to some idea of what is authentic that has been kind of programmed into you by your social media feed. So I see our students really struggling with that. And on the one hand, I worry, and I feel that in the classroom we are fighting against national, even civilizational problems that in one classroom is too small to counteract. On the other hand, I see time and again a base level curiosity about the variety of human experience in our students that really heartens me. And if you play to it, if you encounter it with good faith, our students rise to the challenge.
I'm in a great situation. I can just agree with everybody. Thank you very much for having the opportunity to share a few thoughts with you. I'm a demographer by training, so I think a lot about social and cultural change through the lens of the profound demographic transformation we find ourselves in the midst of in this country. I want to highlight three things for you. Three big moves. The South rises again, the browning and graying of America, and the end of men. If you know your history about the South, for much of the 20th century, really up until 1970, it was the place to leave as opposed to the place to be or to come to. Because of its turbulent racial history, it was an economically backwards region. Far more people left the region than moved to the region. And then around 1970, and continuing in every decade since then, the South, prior to this time, the South only captured about 30% of net national population growth in every decade. In every decade since 1970, the South has captured about half of net national population growth in this country. Good people, we've gone from a region where we speak two languages, to English and bad English, to one we speak well over 300 different languages. Demographically, we have become the cat's meow in terms of destination selection. But it's not about the South, it's about 4 states in the South. It's about Texas, it's about Florida, it's about North Carolina, and it's about Georgia. In every decade since 1970, every day, 7 days a week, during 65 days of the year, we've added about 190 net newcomers in this state alone. During the pandemic, the first 15 months of the pandemic, a net of 253 people arrived in this state every day, profoundly transforming the composition of our population. And so part of what is different over the last 50 years is this profound shift in population nationally in this country, where tag, the South is it, and tag square, North Carolina is one of the most attractive destinations. Undergirding that profound geographic shift is a profound shift in the composition of our population. 2 colorful processes, the browning of America and the graying of America. And both of those things are going on simultaneously. The browning of America is about immigration-driven population change. As you all know, prior to 1965, we had an immigration law that says if we were going to allow immigrants to enter our country, it was important that they not upset the existing racial and ethnic balance of our country as it existed at the turn of the 20th century. So we had a preference for people who were phenotypically similar to Anglo-Saxons. People would come to America, go through the assimilation process. This thing called a melting pot was supposed to work. In other words, we operated on a quota system that was geographically discriminatory against people from certain regions of the world. Go back to the 1880s, we had something called a Chinese exclusion law. Bring it forward to the first decade of the 20th century, we had something called the Asiatic Barrier Region. They shouldn't be allowed to enter this country because it would be, quote unquote, difficult for them to assimilate into American society. And we justified those laws based on a whole series of racist theories about cultural inferiority. That all changed in 1965, coincidence with the civil rights movement, domestic life. We liberalized our immigration law, opening up the doors of our country to people who heretofore had not been allowed to come in large numbers. Basically people from Latin America, Asia, and the Middle East. These are all people of color, and ever since 1965, immigration has driven population change such that we added 22.7 million people to our population in the last decade. Fully 100% of that growth was driven by people of color immigrants and other people of color because the non-Hispanic white population declined by 5.1 million. When your white population declines and you grow, it's all grown. So this profound demographic shift, the change in the composition of college student age population that we're experiencing today is all driven by this fundamental change in our demography and the growing browning of America. And at the same time that we're browning, we are graying. Well, the other piece of the browning, I should say, is the profound shift in marriage patterns in our country. If you look at marriages, you know, it was illegal for blacks and whites to marry until the mid-1960s, late 60s. That all changed, and now you have this huge tendency to out-marry. The most rapidly growing population in the last decade was the 2 or more race population, increased by 390%. So what that means is that the students that's going to be walking in the door at the school won't fit into the nice and neat little crucibles we're accustomed to putting them in, and they won't allow you to put them into those clusters because of all the activism and the experiences and culture that they bring to the setting. But at the same time that browning is going on, we are graying. That's about the aging of our native-born population. Let's get this out of the way. How do you know if you're part of the graying of America? Number one, if you have problems seeing that there are 3 people on this stage or 4, you're part of the graying of America. Number 2, if you got to go to the restroom 3 times during this presentation, you're part of the graying of America. And number 3, if you fall asleep, it's 9:30 in the morning, you're part of the graying of America. The graying of America is about 3 things: increased longevity. We are living much longer today than we ever envisioned in our history. When we introduced Social Security in 1935, the average person turning 65 was going to live another 12.7 years. That same person turning 65 today is going to live another 18.7 years. And we now think living to 100 on a routine basis is well within reach. There's one school of thought that says the person who will live to 130 has already been born. So we're aging, and fertility rates are down. You need to have 2.1 kids to replace yourself. The last time we had above replacement level fertility in this country was in 2008. And so when you have reduced fertility, on the front end of the life course, you have fewer and fewer children, so the top end gets older because we're living longer. It raises a whole series of questions about the future pipeline to higher education because of fertility rates are declining. And then there's a group of us born between 1946 and 1964. We're the boomer generation. We're the part of the post-World War II hormonal rush in America. It was our fathers who went off to World War II and came back home and got busy. Got busy to the tune of producing 81 million of us. On January 1st of 2011, the first baby boomer turned 65 and became eligible for what? Everything. Every day, 7 days a week, 365 days of the year, from 2011 to 2029, we boomers are turning 65 at the rate of 10,000 per day. That's every day. And then when you add to it that the pre-boomers, born in 1945 or earlier, are going to live much longer, that's the silver tsunami. That's the pig in the python. But behind it, we have lower fertility and the like. And so you have this profound shift in the composition of our population. So that aging thing leads us to one of the biggest topics in entrepreneurship today is the longevity economy, and how do we build an economy that is inclusive and respectful of an aging nation. Everything has to change to accommodate an aging population, and so that's the big thing. One of the most profound things I think that impacts higher education is this the end of men thesis. Until 2010, for the first time in history, women were about to surpass men as the numerical majority in the paid workforce. But that's not because we were just trying to treat women fairly, because there's still a huge gender wage gap, but rather that was because men were doing so poorly in American society. The percentage of prime working age men who were disconnected from the labor market has increased substantially since the mid-1960s. Why? Men don't have the skills to compete in a new economy, they're disabled, or they're incarcerated. The sex ratio in higher education has been 60% female, 40% male for 3 decades. I assure you, in the 1940s, it was what? 70-30 male. Those two curves coalesced in 1979, and ever since then, it's been 60-40 across the country in college enrollments. Between 2014, 2015, and 2018, 2019, we granted 45,000 more degrees to women than we did men here at the UNC Chapel Hill. That raises a whole series of questions about dual earner households, whether women will have eligible, marriageable males at their disposal, meaning marrying someone of a comparable education. It has huge implications for everything that we do. And I personally think the cultural wars that we find ourselves in the midst of today is rooted in these profound demographic shifts that we're experiencing now, where people are a bit nervous about the impending change that we find ourselves in the midst of. I'll stop there, and hopefully we can talk about this a little more.
Does the downward shift in fertility correlate with the 2008 recession?
In part, but the other thing is you don't have enough eligible, marriageable men to go around, and then you have a whole cadre of women who are voluntarily childless today. And thirdly, there's something called completed fertility. Okay, I won't give you the big theory today, but it's when women tell their husbands, go take out the trash, ain't nothing else happening here. And completed fertility for women occurs between the ages of 40 and 44. We have a whole generation of women now whose median age is about 45. They've aged out of the childbearing age. So it's a combination of those things that drive declining fertility. Very great question.
Okay, I tell you what, I think the easiest way for us to do this is for you to folks just jump in. There's no point in my calling on people.
So, I have a question, but I want to say, to begin with, if the three of you represent the quality and the enthusiasm of the educational people on this campus, I continue to be thrilled to send money to the University of North Carolina. My question has to do with the religious aspects that we've been talking about, and I'm curious, because when I came to school here, I was exactly the model you described. I'd been raised in the church. I got here and I began to broaden my horizons, get more education, study more science, and that kind of tapered off. Then when my draft number came out, that skied back up. But I wonder if, thinking back to then and the fear of nuclear war and what's happening now with the threats from Russia, if it's possible that there's an impetus for people to turn back to organized religion just out of fear.
That's really interesting. I think that the fear that looms largest for our students is not nuclear war, and this is something I teach a class in which I have students read some of the journalist Jonathan Schell's very vivid thought experiments about, what if a hydrogen bomb hit New York City and this sort of thing. And it's that text is the biggest struggle of any I teach in terms of getting it to connect with students, even though I make the point to them that we're in a position now with all sorts of kind of moldering, nuclear storehouses in the former Soviet Union, where it's much more likely that we might have a low level but still incredibly deadly and horrific nuclear accident or terrorist attack than was true in the Cold War. But even despite that, it doesn't really resonate. What resonates is climate change, and is the looming catastrophe, the sense that they've inherited this terrible set of problems. I mean, and they would argue, and it's hard, this is perhaps unfalsifiable, but they would argue that this is connected to the declining fertility rate, because so often they say, why would I want to bring children into this world if their situation will be so much worse? I think, though, that climate change is potentially an opportunity for a reclamation of religious authority that is bipartisan. And I've had some interesting conversations with liberal Christians who lament the way in which their institutions have really receded in public authority, do not have, if you go back 50, 60 years and look across the landscape, who are the influential public intellectuals? You would find people like Reinhold Niebuhr. You would point to the leaders of the civil rights movement. So many of whom, were coming out of deeply convicted, explicit religious backgrounds, whether it's Martin Luther King Jr. or Abraham Heschel. These are people who were speaking to the problems of their time from a pretty explicitly religious framework. And there is a case to be made that a kind of a transcendent call for care of creation is one that Christianity and other religious traditions have the theological resources to tackle. I see, too, some interesting movement on this question among more conservative Christians as well, especially younger Christians who would say that they're sympathetic to what they call the creation care movement. One that does focus, has a broader sense of what commitment to the ethic of life, and not just human life, ought to mean. But perhaps we should juxtapose to that the role of religion in global polarization. And here's perhaps where your comment about Russia is relevant. One of the major ways in which Putin has mobilized public sentiment on his behalf is through an alliance with the Russian Orthodox leadership in that country, and by tapping into what I would say is the kind of ugly side of religious identity that so easily dovetails with our tribal instincts. And so religion is not good or bad, right? And religion, whatever your metaphysics, religion as it is as manifested in human society is always tainted by our depravity and ennobled by the degree to which we can transcend our depravity. And so we see it showing up in both the hopeful aspects of our current world situation as well as those that make us want to cry ourselves to sleep at night.
Did you watch the 60 Minutes interview with the new leader of the Southern Baptist Convention, and his conflict in supporting Donald Trump, that before the first election he did not vote for him because he felt he was an extremely immoral man. Now he's flipped back to support him, and I have watched and read how there is a lot of conflicted conservative evangelical leadership in the Christian church about the support for the extreme positions that some of the right-wing people embodied in Trump have. And I just wondered how you felt about that, because I found it extremely interesting. On the one hand, he says the man's immoral. On the other hand, I like what he says about certain issues, so I'm going to support him. And that conversation I've seen taking place on a broader scale, whether you are a Republican or a Democrat, Christian, Muslim, or whatever, about the morality of this and the extreme position some of the ultra-conservative Christian, in particular, sects have had. I don't know if that's playing out on the campus or how that's coming about, but I just wonder what your reaction to that interview, if you saw it, was.
I didn't see that interview, but I can speak to the broader question you're raising, which is an important one. There's a huge range of reasons why Americans chose to support Donald Trump. And even if we reduce that to just talking about white conservative evangelicals, there's still a huge range of reasons. Going from people who felt and feel very, very gung-ho for the whole package and love the sort of, stick it to the establishment vulgarity of him, to those who absolutely held their nose but feel deeply convicted on the question of abortion and saw this as a crucial move with the Supreme Court in view. Evangelical voters are like most voters in that they have a centuries-long history of being political pragmatists. So you can go back to the turn of the 19th century and find the Baptists making their peace with Thomas Jefferson as a candidate who they considered deeply heterodox and someone who didn't share their worldview in all kinds of ways, but they agreed on the question of religious freedom. So this pattern of making profound compromises in order to achieve a political goal is an old one and a familiar one. And I think, too, there is a way in which evangelical Protestantism, because it is a kind of an entrepreneurial religious tradition in which there is not a powerful hierarchy in most cases that controls, who gets to run what church and the career trajectories of pastors. Pastors tend to be a bit more captive, needing to respond in more strategic ways to the views of their congregations. And so I think that they are in a more complicated position, perhaps, than a Catholic bishop or a Lutheran bishop would be, who has a little bit more institutional protection. I'll make one big point. We could go down a whole rabbit hole of analyzing conservative Christian support for Trump, which I don't necessarily want to do. But the big point I'll make is that the appeal of Trump is maybe the number one factor has to do with the end of men, has to do with the way in which Trump's portrayal of masculinity and his ability to both make his supporters, to both claim a kind of strongman vision of power, while also articulating the sense of victimization, being screwed over by the economy, by other demographic groups in the United States who seem to have jumped the queue and have gotten advantages that have left particularly white working class men behind. His ability to tap into that feeling of male resentment is maybe the number one aspect of his appeal. And not just to men, by the way, because men are always in the context of a family. And I believe that a huge part of female support for Donald Trump has to do with what women have seen happen to the men in their families. And they see Donald Trump as someone who articulates the horror and what they see as the injustice of that. But Jim, I'd love your thoughts on the demographic piece of this.
I think you're right on the money. I think when you look at men, you have a group of men for whom Trump who are angry at the Republican establishment and the Democratic establishment. They view the Democratic establishment as favoring people of color in policy making, and they are angry at Republicans for sending jobs offshore. And then you have Trump coming in and just poo-pooing everybody and saying, I got somebody who's speaking for me now. Whether or not they're speaking in their self-interest is a whole different question, but the notion of a rebellious kind of response, as it's been communicated here, I think that is absolutely part of the root of the enormous polarization. And I think one of the problems with this polarization is we always talk about having courageous conversations. Rarely do we set the rules for courageous listening. And that's the problem.
Yeah, I got a question on religion. I'm part of a grade A group that does some reading, and we're reading Dostoevsky's story on the Inquisitor. Are you familiar with that story?
Which Dostoevsky story?
The Inquisitor.
The Grand Inquisitor.
Yeah, the Grand Inquisitor. So, do students pick up any identification on social pressure reading that story?
Can you say more? And maybe not everybody's familiar with the context you're evoking. What do you mean exactly?
Well, the story is about the Grand Inquisitor that's going to come in, and he takes the identification of the symbol of religion and challenges everything that he's about, and the response is silence and the presence of another process that is non-institutional or non-social pressure. My question is, do the students today ever deal with that kind of story? That's a pretty difficult story. If you've ever read it, I don't know if you're into that or not.
Do we ask students to
Well, it's not a story that translates into taking the barricades or doing the things we did in the 60s. It's a story about finding place. Yeah, never mind. If you don't, maybe it's just
I'm trying to extract what I think is the important broader point that you're driving at. Certainly, I don't teach that part of Brothers Karamazov, but I teach a course on sin and evil in modern America.
Right.
And one of the major themes of that course is the way in which even my secular students are unwilling to let go of words like evil because we need them at some level. To talk about the injustice they see in the world, the suffering they see purely in terms of biochemistry or a person being shaped by their environment or random chance, it does not do justice to the kind of the human dilemma and the depth of what they're feeling. And so they are hungry for some source, even those of them who have, for whatever their own reasons, abandoned traditional religious sources of authority. I think they are hungry for some language of transcendence, both in order to navigate social pressure and to figure out what is the difference between my own views and some deeper conviction I can stand on, and narratives I've been fed by my community, my family, and my friends, as well as to just sort of navigate their values and make basic professional choices. I mean, can I be interested in your thoughts on this question of identity and the role of the arts in that conversation and how you see students now navigating that as compared to in the past?
Well, yeah, it's really complicated, and part of it has to do with at least within the arts, how the arts has become very personal in a sense that before the internet, the television, music itself was a destination. We knew on Sunday nights at a certain time where we were going to be, and everybody watched it. And if you missed it, you missed it. Period. And now, if somebody said, "Well, did you see that?" And I said, "Well, no, but I'll watch it later on the internet, or I'll watch it whatever." It's a very personalized thing. But I think what's come out of it is that, and social media, by the way, is an interesting place. It's a soapbox for people's ideas and opinions and whatnot, but it's not a conversation. It's more about this is how I feel, and you can feel however you do, but don't do it on my page. So courageous listening is really a powerful statement, a real good takeaway for me. But what I found is that in general, and this is hardly a sample because there's millions of people, but I find it pretty consistent that students are not necessarily engaged in the political process. They're, election day will come and go and they pay lip service to like, hey, have you voted? Yeah, I'm registered. But there's no enthusiasm. We were talking earlier about the mass protests and things that happened in the 70s, the 60s, through the 80s even. And during that time, every one of those people were going to vote. They were going to go. They were going to become part of the process. Their whole protest was not against the establishment itself, but what was happening within the establishment, and that they meant to change that, but all within the context of keeping it all together. And now that's fraying. And it's fraying, and my concern in listening to what Jim was talking about, my concern is going forward is going to have a generation of people who are not as much a part of the process as we were, as has been in previous elections. And it can be attributed to a lot of things. I'll let people like Jim and Molly talk to that. But the reality of it is this is what's happening. And that's a major concern. The arts, it's all the arts can do is reflect the expression that is taking place in the streets. But if it's not shared by the masses as it once were, I'm not quite sure what the influence is going to be going forward. It's there, but it's rather than being a soundtrack for their lives, it's background music. And that may change, obviously, but there's no central force uniting everybody together within the arts. It's very different, and everybody's experience of it is very private. It's very personal, and it's not necessarily shared by everybody. And that's a ripple effect throughout society. So I'm not really sure, because the graying of America is exactly right on. And the generation that we're relying on to keep us, to move us forward, to advance an agenda of equality and peace in the world is just not existing right now, at least as it appears to me.
Question for Dr. Johnson. Can you take us, I appreciate your explanation of the past and getting us to where we are. Can you take us into the future, what you see happening?
Yes, so I just did this piece, and I'm happy to share it. And the title of it is Warning, Demographic Gale Force Winds Ahead. We experienced the second slowest rate of growth, population growth in our history in the last decade, where we grew by 7.4%. The slowest rate of growth in our country was during the Great Depression, when we grew by 7.3%. And that notion of continuing to grow slower, progressively slower, is something that is going to happen. Here in North Carolina, in the 90s, we grew by 1.4 million, 1.42 million. In the 2000s, we grew by 1.4 million. In the last decade, we grew by 900,000 people. That's 500,000 slower. And it's got to do with, we put up barriers to immigrants. We have declining population fertility rates. The thing that I didn't talk a lot about are deaths of despair, of prime working age people who are dying due to suicides, opioids, and alcohol overdose. Close to 1 million people, ages 25 to 44, premature deaths since the late 1990s, and we lost 100,000 people in the last year to opioid deaths by themselves. You can't sustain a social security system because it's a pay-as-you-go system if the 25 to 44-year-old population is what? Disappearing. And so this slowing growth is something that we don't understand or we haven't fully grasped moving down the road. We have some real challenges inherent in that.
So living, I think, special, consider yourself special to be part of this baby boomer generation where we have power and money and so forth. But we're aging out.
Right.
But I understand there's another wave behind us that's equally large to our generation of white.
The wave behind you, that's the one that's dying, the under 25 population actually declined in the last decade. You got to look at the workforce. I mean, it's a fundamental. I'm a boomer, so I can talk about that. I'm not talking about you, I'm talking about me as well. You know, when people say that they don't want to invest in their taxes in K-12 education and things like that because their kids are out of school and all of that stuff, that's a mistake. To argue that you don't have a dog in the K-12 education fight is a mistake. It's called the future competitiveness of our nation. And what I tell people like myself, I say to you, sooner or later you're going to age to the level somebody's got to take care of your old butt. You do want them to be able to read your prescriptions and count your pills. I can show you a whole generation that, first of all, that generation is smaller and smaller, and secondly, when you don't invest in K-12 education, that's the problem you have. Raise a whole serious question about what the future pipeline to higher education is going to look like with slowing growth and changing composition of that population. This is a very pivotal period at that I'm not sure that we're really reflecting on the impending changes that we find ourselves in the midst of. Yes, sir.
I think that it's critical. I'm glad that we've asked a demographer, because especially at the time of identity politics, you better start with who we are. I think the most critical thing, the couple things that are going to affect fertility. One is, I think the most important thing you can say about marriage these days is the drift from marriage, the irrelevance of marriage to childbearing and the implications that has had. And then the one that really frightens me, if anybody is, and I don't know whether it's microplastics or global warming, but what's happening to sperm counts is really, really terrifying. Male sperm counts are going.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
What is being done at UNC to create more constructive listening? How do you teach freshmen to be constructive listeners? Or is that something that's focused
Make them
on
seniors.
in the freshman and sophomore years when you still have
I think we
more
have
interest or whatever?
freshman seminars and around themes and the like. Whether or not we're engaging in the courageous conversations about issues is totally a different kind of thing. I don't think faculty are trained to do this kind of engagement that has to happen to produce the next generation of talent. I teach at a business school, and CEOs say that what they want out of our higher education system are young people who can groove on ambiguity. Because the new normal in society is certain uncertainty. The only thing that you can rest assured of, I don't know what has happened, but I guarantee you, since we've been here, if you flip on your phone, something crazy has happened that is disruptive, and we all are gonna have to be able to navigate that certain uncertainty moving. What do you need in your toolkit to navigate certain uncertainty? I don't think we're addressing that issue in higher education. It's not just for some corporate person, it's for life in general. That what do you look at if you're 60-some years old and the stock market just went further south than North Carolina, and it's constant change. We talk about climate change, but I keep a running tab of the crises that happen. At the same time, we had George Floyd, we had the fourth worst hurricane season on the East Coast, fires on the West Coast. You just go on with the kinds of things that we're having to deal with. And in a society where it's instant information, the afternoon newspaper no longer works.
Jim, you teed me up perfectly, because this program that UNC began in 2019 that I'm running this year, the Program for Public Discourse, is really trying to address exactly this problem. Faculty in many ways, we tend to be a little bit arrogant about our work in the classroom, and we think we're creating an environment in which there's this great free exchange of ideas, and students can say anything they want, and it's like the Enlightenment embodied, and we just know that that's not true, and it's partly because we're up against these national, sort of global forces, but it's also because there are skills and ways of thinking about classroom conversation that we maybe are not as engaged with as we ought to be. So this program does workshops, both for faculty who want to get better at helping students have these difficult conversations about polarizing issues, to learn how to listen to another perspective without feeling threatened, and respond in a productive way. And we're also beginning to do more of this kind of training for students as well. And so I'm hopeful that this is just a small way in which we can chip away at this problem. I want to say one thing about this point on ambiguity, which is so important. And this is one of the huge problems that I see as a professor at Carolina. And that is that our K through 12 system trains students to flee ambiguity and to think that success in life comes from learning exactly how to take the tests that are part of the mandated curriculum that will then result in you getting the admissions letter that you want. And it's just, education is simply a matter of memorizing both facts, but also what is ideologically the accepted answer that will make you the nice person that no one will really object to. And then they get to university, and they're confronted by an essay assignment to which there is no single right answer. The whole point of which is to navigate ambiguity, and they panic. And often they mistake this confrontation with ambiguity for a medicalized anxiety that means that they're diseased and broken, and they're not normal, when actually they're having the normal experience of growing up intellectually. And so I think, in the context of our mental health crisis in higher education, we need to get better at navigating between steering students who absolutely do need medical professional help for the resources they need, on the one hand, yes. On the other hand, telling them anxiety is just the normal feeling of facing the world's ambiguity. And this is what a university education is supposed to be. Don't run from it. Delight in the confusion. See it as an opportunity.
Is there any plan? Is there any plan for part of the public discourse sessions to be recorded or put out on the internet? Because these problems that you're describing are not just for students and faculty. It's universal now. And learning how to do that, even for people our age, would be valuable.
The other major piece of what we do are public events, which are panels when we bring people, we make an effort to bring people who have very different perspectives on some polarizing question. And we hope that these events model constructive conversation. It's not a debate. It's not a pro-con debate. It's supposed to be a little bit more constructive than that. And those are always public. And they're also almost always on Zoom live as well as in person. And we would love to have you all join our mailing list.
We will, so let me interrupt real quickly. We will send out a link to everyone here with information on PPD because we've partnered with them on a few events. And so you'll have easy access to what they're doing, but recording in future.
Let me just say one thing about the academic community and dealing with ambiguity. I think it's important for us to be able to guarantee kids the opportunity to have free-flowing conversation without it being everywhere else. I think that's our job. When we engage in, it's about education, it's not about politicization. And people use things in the media in all kinds of ways where an employer has a right to ask you for social media stuff and to decide your future based on that. This has got to be about what producing a high quality education and what it means to be a graduate of UNC Chapel Hill and what the tools you have in your toolkit. This is not about politicization or indoctrination. It's about dealing with ambiguity in a VUCA world. That's a unique set of skills. And I think that we need to be careful and mindful that we do operate in a larger society where these are enormously polarizing issues, but can we have critical discourse and train students how to deal with them without it being all of this stuff that lends itself to abuse?
A couple of years ago, I think one of the major banks in North Carolina was going to donate money to UNC with the proviso that you taught things a certain way. And have any of you, or do you know of faculty who are influenced by this, or does it not exist? I know the legislature has, they have their own opinions on how this university should run. Businesses who donate as well. Has any of that ever come up?
Yes. I mean, most recently, you may have read about the journalism school's struggle with their major donor, the Husband family, over the appointment of Nicole Hannah-Jones, and that's a very complicated story. I think it's deeply misunderstood by the press. Now's not the time to rehash that. And certainly the founding of the program that I'm running, it evoked for many people that earlier history of an effort to found a program that was supposed to be explicitly focused on the Western canon, and the donors did want to have a fairly active role in aspects of the curriculum. I think a couple of things have happened. One, this has opened up what is still a somewhat lopsided conversation about the role of private money in education. A conversation that I think focuses a lot more on a couple of conservative bogeymen and doesn't actually take into account the vast swath of ideological influence present in private money in various forms. It's a conversation that's important as our universities are less and less funded by public money and driven more and more to private fundraising. I mean, Carolina, at least in the humanities, I'll speak to my part of campus, we're not in a good place financially. And we're expected to do more with less. And we are going to have to rely more and more on our own private fundraising. I mean, the chair of my department now spends a huge amount of time trying to raise money to get the basic work of the history department done in a way that her predecessors never had to do that. I will say also, though, that I think that there's been a shift among donors. I think that donors, this is certainly true among conservative donors, and it's true of the ones that progressives are scared of, like the Koch Foundation. They have become more realistic in their expectations regarding the money that they put into higher education and what they need to expect in terms of a more hands-off approach that preserves academic freedom in a way that is acceptable to people in universities. This is not to say that there isn't still a problem with dark money and conservatives seeing where progressive bureaucrats have abandoned, say, the humanities and stepping in and funding history of capitalism professorship that fills a vacuum because no one else is putting money into history professorships, but gives them an avenue for control. I mean, so there are these cases of explicit ideological influence, but it's important to be nuanced about this conversation, to respect the ways in which I think donors have learned from that wave of controversies that characterized the past 20 years and have stepped back to some extent, and to open up the conversation in kind of a bipartisan way and talk openly about the role of ideology across the spectrum in privatized funding in higher education.
We have time for probably one more question, just to keep on schedule.
Excuse me, if I can ask a question to any of the panel members. So related to this question, the question about operating with ambiguity, one of the things I read a lot of in business papers and books is the challenges not only of universities, but even the military. My background's career military, in taking today's students and having operate as teams. Because of the independence that social media has caused, one of the challenges that I read about is when business accepts these people, or even the military brings them in, they have to focus on having to operate as a team. Whether it's finance with marketing, communications with R&D, what are your observations in that area? Or do you see that?
Well, I teach in the business school, and we are very much team driven, and we are conscious in creating those teams that reflect the composition of the student body, international students versus women versus veterans versus people of color. So we're trying to model in the team orientation of our program those realities. I think the real challenge and issue is, particularly in business education, is whether or not we are willing to expand the way we train to factor in geopolitical realities of the business world. You can't teach finance or accounting in isolation of the turbulence that's going on, and how do you manage. Part of that movement on ambiguity is, yes, I have to do accounting, but I have to do it in a world where the new normal is certain uncertainty. And what are you guaranteeing me in this products, the students, and the talent that you're generating that assures me that these people can handle the shifting tides in the economic marketplace or the global marketplace? I think that we need to think more fully and develop and revise the curriculum in a way that we assure that is delivered in the marketplace. And that's whether you go on to work for government, nonprofit sector, or the private sector. I just think that we need to rethink what we are creating and making sure that whatever a young person's aspirations are, that we have equipped them with the skills to deal with that new normal of certain uncertainty.
So folks, we came here at age 18, give or take. And many of us had some fabulous teachers who could open our minds. I think that comment you made before, imagine that 18, 19, 20-year-old kid spending a semester with these guys. Okay, Marvin, did you?
I just want to thank you all for coming, and this this was my little baby, and I'm so proud of the product.